So welcome everyone to another video from a county for old cars, and you join me once again in the 1967 Triumph Vitesse 2 litre. It is a glorious late May Friday afternoon. In fact, we're just before the bank holiday weekend, and fortunately for us the roads look really clear today. But in a slight change from stuff that we've done previously, we're going to take some of the very quiet back lanes on this little journey. And when I say quiet lanes, I'm actually referring to the local authorities designated quiet lanes. And these are signposted with a little sort of green sign which warns motorists that the lanes are used by dog walkers, cyclists and equestrians. And we're just turning into one now, which you'll see, which is also sometimes used by cars, but we'll let them go forward first. But the idea is that traffic should proceed at a slow, gentle pace and make allowances for the fact that other road users may actually be in the middle of the road. As we've just seen, most of these tend to be single file only, so you have to be prepared to sort of pull over or back up when necessary. But these are lovely little roads, particularly for anyone who has a pre-war car who wants to sort of get out of the sort of hustle of modern traffic. And there are lots of ways to navigate Suffolk, staying off these main roads, where you can comfortably, as we're doing now, trundle along at 20 miles an hour. But I often think that little lanes like this are kind of the natural habitat for some of the early pre-war cars, and every so often I'm lucky enough to come along something or come across something from the 1920s or early 30s. It'd be wonderful if that happened this afternoon, but I suspect given it's a weekday, it's not such a likely thing. Now, we're headed to a very pretty little village called Marlesford, which is just up the road, and most of Marlesford is designated as being a quiet lane, certainly the very centre. And this is ironic because most people who think of Marlesford think of it as the strip of A12 that lies between Wickham Market and Stratford St Andrew, but there is this beautiful little hamlet, and this is one of the rare villages in Suffolk which is still largely owned and managed by its own estate. And Marlesford has its own country house, which is occupied by Lord and Lady Marlesford, and they have managed to preserve the centre of the village. There's a mixture of architecture from the 17th century right through to the Edwardian era, and a mixture of building materials from oak frame timber farmhouses to little stone and flint and brick cottages. And one of the back lanes we're going to be driving on when we go through the village will take us through the little ford. Sorry to say that the water level probably won't be high enough to actually cross the road when we go through, but we'll be getting a glimpse of the infant River Orr, and this is the river which flows all the way downstream to Aldborough and then to Orford. And what I'm also hoping to do is to make a short diversion from Marlesford over to Wickham Market, where we'll be able to have a very quick look at the infant River Deben, and you'll see that these two rivers sort of run in neighbouring valleys, and of course in the Deben's case the estuary is at Bordsey, where we've done some filming before, but more importantly it passes through the town of Woodbridge, and of course in medieval times Woodbridge was an important port and associated with shipbuilding and sailcloth manufacturing and also rope making. So we're coming down into this second quiet lane in Marlesford, and you'll be able to see in a little while on our right there is the village church. Pull in and give you a little glimpse of that. So excuse me while I move the camera around, but we'll give you a quick very, very pretty. So again, as we look up this way, you can see we've got examples of thatched buildings, and then across to my left, some very pretty little stone and flint cottages there. We're approaching the ford now. I'll stop in a second and just give you a quick look at the river, such as it is, but yeah. Just ahead of us is the railway crossing cottage, minus its railway, and there would have been obviously a level crossing and gates just where the nose of the car is, and the railway line would have come straight across in front of the, or to the side of the cottage. The reason it's not there it can be summed up by two words: doctor beaching. And like railways or little branch lines all over the country, this one, which ran from Campsie Ash and Marlesford Station on to Framlingham, simply didn't survive the 1960s. But the railway cottages, or these crossing cottages rather, had to be occupied full time because it was necessary to manually open and close the gates for the trains as they came through. So being a gatekeeper was a really important job in the 19th century, and lasted right up until the mid-20th century in these rural areas. About 30 years ago, I have a chance to talk to one of the local farmers, and his name was Roger, and he explained that he used to go to school in Framlingham by train from Marlesford station every morning as a little boy. Roger's experience was an interesting one because he grew up on the farm that he eventually took over and ran as a young man, but he didn't care for school as a little boy, and what he really wanted to do is stay at home on the farm and be with obviously the livestock and playing with machinery and frankly learning the sort of farming skills that he would need in later life. And I don't think he thought school was for him. And so what he used to do was he would be put on the train by his mother, and he would wait in the carriage until the train came to a stop, because it was necessary in a couple of places where the railway line went through some of the pasture. It was necessary to have gates to stop the cattle from getting onto the line. Now, there were no gatekeepers at this point because there's no road, so the engine driver would have to stop the engine, and either the fireman or the guard would be responsible for jumping out, opening the gate, and then the train would go through, and then it would stop again, and then they'd have to close the gate to stop the cattle from escaping. And what Roger learned to do was to leap out of the carriage when the train was stopped and race back home through the fields, which he usually managed to do undetected. Well, it got to the point where, out of sheer frustration, the school, Roger's mother, and the guard on the train decided the only way to stop him from playing hooky from school was to actually lock him in the guard's van. And so for at least a couple of years, Roger used to find himself going to school under lock and key in the guard's van. I don't think it did anything to improve his view of school or railways as it comes to that, but I guess it's an interesting thought. You know, would that sort of thing be allowed nowadays? You know, is it something that you can do, lock children in a guard's van? Doubt it. So we're just taking a diversion down this little lane here to the village of Easton. And Easton is famous because it has a serpentine brick wall, which is commonly referred to as the crinkle-crankle wall. And this wall denotes the boundary of what was once a magnificent country house, Easton Park. And sadly, it was owned and was the family seat of the Duke of Hamilton. But after the First World War, like so many country houses, it was broken up and demolished. The lands of the estates, and the estates were extensive, it included villages like Easton, Parham and Great Glenham. They were parcelled up and sold off for farmland, and neighbouring estates bought some of the land. Some of the smaller farms expanded by taking in additional acreage, but the house itself had frankly become just too expensive to run, both in terms of manpower and financially, and largely to do with the post-war government imposing such high taxation on the aristocracy, but also a change in attitudes. As with many places in Suffolk after the Great War, the sort of role of men working on farms had changed. There was a move towards mechanization, and attitudes had changed, and I think a lot of the working families began to look back on their history as a kind of serfdom and wanted better things for their children and future generations. And there was a move away from villages into towns, and this reflected the sort of growing industrialization. But there's no doubt there was a great deal of social progress, but also a great deal of architectural loss. And I think I illustrated that in one of my first videos about Sudbourne Hall, where you can see all that is left is the ancillary buildings like the stable quadrangle. In the case of Easton, a lot of the architecture from the 19th century, including the school, which is off to our right, which was sort of imposed by the Duke of Hamilton and his family, this architecture still remains, and it is beautiful. There are some earlier cottages here as well, of course, but lots of interesting features like Gothic arched windows, which have been sort of retrospectively imposed on these timber frame buildings to sort of mimic the style of the early to mid 19th century. But you'll see ahead of us the beginning of the Great Wall which runs around this village. And we're just going past the gates on the right hand side, but from this moment on you can see the Serpentine Wall, or the Crinkle-crankle Wall. And it's interesting because a lot of people think that it was a display of ostentation. In other words, you know, you had to have a lot of money to waste bricks building in this fashion. But in truth, the reverse was true. The Serpentine Wall is a method of constructing which uses fewer bricks, because you can have a thinner skinned wall, you can have a single skinned wall which becomes self-supporting without the need for buttresses or without the need for additional skins. And so it's proved here. It's not only beautiful, but it is long lasting. Every few years we get a gale which brings down one of the trees which will break the wall, but they always manage to sort of patch it back up. We're now coming towards a little village called Letheringham here, and again we're just crossing the River Deben. I'm just going to turn the camera around so you can have a little look at that, and just get a little view of the road ahead of us. But this is a wonderful landscape. Carry on. Just to our right we've got a lovely old tithe barn, and it's very rare to see one which hasn't been converted into a house. These are an important part of the Suffolk countryside, usually made out of oak and nearly always thatched. And of course it was a place to flail corn and also to store it as well. nowadays these buildings have become redundant as agricultural buildings because they're not substantial enough either to admit the sort of vehicles that are used on farms, nor do they have anywhere near the kind of capacity to store the sort of grain or other produce that is that comes in at harvest time. And so in many cases they've been converted to houses, and this is a sort of process that began in the 1980s. And I have to say these barn conversions vary in quality, and some of them are tastefully done, others frankly are just a sort of pastiche of what was there before. And yeah, I always feel sad when I see them sort of torn apart in that way, but it's nice to see one that hasn't been destroyed, although what its long-term future is, who knows. And we've got an example of a beautiful farmhouse right in front of us. In this case, what has happened is the house has been divided into 3 cottages, and this is a process which used to occur quite a lot in the 19th century, and at different times after the agricultural revolution there were periods of prosperity for farmers, and in the Georgian era particularly, so the late 18th century, there was a lot of money coming into farming, and farmers were able to build new buildings really for the first time. The families had been living in these farmhouses for sort of 200-300 years, and suddenly there's money available to construct modern houses as they would have been then. And of course a lot of them were built in the Georgian and then later Victorian styles. But of course the original farmhouse, the old timber frame one like the one we've just seen, would still have a value. And so the simplest thing to do would be to divide it up and turn it into labourers' cottages. And that's an example of what we've just seen there. So we're now heading to Wickham Market, which is our sort of final stop, I would say. And what I'm going to do is to give you a quick look at the mill at Wickham Market, and then we'll trundle up the high street into the market square itself. So we'll just jump out and have a little look at the watermill and see what you think. Just to give you a sense of the landscape we're looking at, these are the water meadows which will run alongside the banks of the River Deben, which is sort of directly past the Black Pony you can see in the distance there. And in the winter it can be completely flooded, and it looks like a sort of fantastic lake, and for a day or so you get all sorts of wildfowl that sort of descend on the meadow. The poor old horses have to be moved to higher ground, and I think they're pretty miserable about it, but yeah, the wildfowl absolutely love it. So the road we're looking at used to be the main A12, which of course used to come through the village. But just across the bridge you can see Wickham Market's watermill to give you this spectacular view. And this, believe it or not, is the River Deben, so its source is around Deben, sort of up towards mid-Suffolk. Right, let's have a look at the Market Square next. Obviously the mill was, 200 years ago, a very important part of the local economy. But there was also a little foundry here during the 19th century where they manufactured agricultural machinery and implements. And it's just off to our right. There's a white metal gate post in front of what was the old drawing office, which is the sort of white brick building with a parapet. And that's the only reminder there that that gate post, which was made in the foundry, is all that there is left to sort of remind us of the Victorian industrial past. The town does have a couple of little industrial units, and there's a bit of light manufacturing which still happens here, but mostly it's residential. And you'll see on our left we've got modern houses, on the right we've got properties like the one we've just gone past, which is actually Tudor in origin, a little terrace of Georgian houses with these pretty little balconies on the first floor. And then when you get into the Market Square, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's all Georgian, but in actual fact, well, a lot of the houses that appear to be Georgian are actually medieval, but with Georgian facades added in the late 1700s to sort of facelift them, as it were. And we'll just do a quick circuit of the Market Square. But Wickham Market is a good place to stop off again if you're sort of travelling towards Framlingham. There are a couple of coffee shops here, supermarket, even a library, and there's a primary school and doctor surgery. So it's a sustainable village, and one that's become increasingly popular and affluent. Hard to believe, but the road we're driving on here was sort of 40 years ago the A12. You can just imagine the kind of traffic jams there must have been, with London traffic heading to Lowestoft coming down this little narrow street. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little trip out, and I've certainly had a good time sort of soaking up the sunshine in Tess. Perfect top-down weather. And if you do own an older car, something pre-war, then hopefully this might have inspired you to have a look at some of the quieter and slower lanes in Suffolk, and you know, think about getting your car out and enjoying it the way that I do. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in my next video. Take care.